Story number 1.
I was 15 years old when I had the most terrifying birthday of my life, back in 2003. My parents had just moved us to an old farmhouse in the countryside. It wasn't exactly what I had imagined for a birthday celebration, but we'd been settled in for a few months and I was hoping for a fun time with my friends. The farmhouse had been in my mom's family for years, and it was a beautiful, sprawling place with a large yard, creaky floors, and old-fashioned furniture. It was also isolated, surrounded by fields on every side, which gave it a somewhat eerie feel, especially at night. My mom insisted that it was a perfect place to grow up, even if I wasn't so sure. But my parents promised this would be a birthday to remember. The house was big enough to host my friends, and they made sure we had all the snacks and cake we could ever want. The day started off normally, and I didn't feel the usual twinge of dread I'd gotten used to. My best friend Carla arrived in the afternoon with a gift wrapped in shiny blue paper, and we spent the next few hours catching up. A few of my other friends, Jared and Lisa, joined us, and by evening, the house was buzzing with excitement. As we were setting up in the dining room for the cake, I noticed something strange in the hallway, just beyond the dining room, a flicker of movement, just a shadow in the corner of my eye. I quickly turned my head, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. It wasn't until later that night that I began to question everything. The party was in full swing, and the lights in the dining room twinkled with that warm yellow glow that made everything feel cozy. We were in the middle of opening gifts when I heard a door creaking open behind us. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see my mom or dad coming into the room, but no one was there. The door to the guest room at the end of the hallway was ajar, and that's when I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. It was as though someone had opened it and was standing there, watching us. "Emma, are you okay?" Carla asked, noticing that I had gone quiet. I forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, just thought I saw something." "You're seeing things," Jared teased, his voice light and carefree. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't imagining it. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I tried to push it out of my mind, focusing on the cake and my friends' laughter, but when it came time for everyone to leave, it felt like the atmosphere in the house had changed. The air felt thick, like something had shifted. My friends were gone by around midnight, and my parents had already gone to bed. I cleaned up a bit, then headed upstairs to my room. As I walked down the hall, I noticed that the door to the guest room was still open. It hadn't been that way earlier. I figured my parents must have left it that way, but the thought didn't sit well with me. Something about the room just felt off, cold, even despite the warm summer night. I decided to go to bed, but every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing the same creaking sound, like footsteps moving slowly down the hallway. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. That's what my parents had always said when the old wooden floors creaked and groaned. But then it happened again. The creaking grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable this time. Someone was walking in the hall outside my room. I held my breath, straining to listen, but I didn't hear anything else for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I slowly sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps were real. I stood up, cautiously walking to my bedroom door. I hesitated, then cracked it open a tiny bit, peering into the dark hallway. At first, I saw nothing, but then my eyes fixed on the guest room door. It was wide open now. For a moment, everything stood still. Then I saw it. A figure. No more than a shadow, really, lurking just inside the room. It was a tall, thin figure, almost ghostly in the dim light that spilled from the hallway. The shadow seemed to flicker, like it wasn't entirely real, like it didn't belong there. I blinked, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but when I opened my eyes, the figure was still there. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out for my parents, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure in the room. It moved slightly, as if it noticed me watching. And then it turned. The figure's face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I screamed, and in that instant, the figure vanished. The air in the hallway went still again, and the only sound was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I rushed into my parents' room without thinking, shaking my mother awake. "Mom, there's someone in the house," I gasped, barely able to form words. She sat up, clearly disoriented. "What do you mean?" "Emma, it's late. You're just having a nightmare. There's no one here." I looked toward the door, but the hallway was empty. "I saw something," I said, still trembling. "A person, a figure, in the guest room." My mom sighed and rubbed her eyes. "Sweetheart, it's just an old house. You've been awake too long. It's probably just your imagination." But I knew what I had seen. The shadow, the figure, those hollow eyes, they were real. That night I barely slept. The image of that figure burned into my mind. The next morning I tried to push it aside, telling myself I had imagined the whole thing, but the unease never fully left. That evening, I avoided the guest room completely. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that room, something I couldn't explain. A few weeks later, I got the courage to ask my mom about the guest room. "Why did we even have a guest room?" I asked, half joking, half serious. She gave me a funny look. "Well, it used to be my grandmother's room," she said. "When we moved here, we decided to keep it for guests." I was about to ask more, but then my mom paused and looked at me strangely, as though she was remembering something. "Why do you ask?" I hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. "I don't know. Something feels off about that room. I saw something in there the other night." She froze. "What do you mean?" "I saw a figure," I whispered. "A shadow." My mom looked at me for a long moment, her face unreadable. "There's something you should know," she said softly. "This house has always been a little strange." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. My mom took a deep breath. "Before we moved here, Grandma told me about the history of the house. It used to belong to a couple who lived here in the 1920s. The woman, she died in the guest room." I felt a chill creep over me. "How?" "I don't know for sure," my mom said, "but Grandma always said there was something tragic about her death, that the woman never left the house, that she still wandered the halls." I froze, the pieces clicking together in my mind. It was the woman I had seen, her figure in the guest room, her hollow eyes. "I don't know if it's real or if it's just an old story, Emma," my mom said quietly. "But I think there's more to this house than we understand." After that conversation, I avoided the guest room entirely. I never told anyone about the figure again, but I never forgot the feeling that someone was always watching, lingering in the shadows. Even now, whenever I think back to that birthday, I can still remember the cold presence in that room, the woman with hollow eyes. Sometimes I wonder if she's still there, waiting for the next person to notice her. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was the year 2003, and I had just turned 16. My birthday was always a big deal in my family. We'd have a small gathering of close friends, a big cake, and my parents would spoil me with presents. But this year, things were different. We had recently moved to a new house, a huge, old Victorian mansion that was far from the bright, happy home I was used to. The house had been in my dad's family for years, and though it looked picturesque on the outside, something about it felt off, especially at night. My friends and I joked about how creepy the house was, but deep down, I felt uneasy about it. My birthday fell on a Friday that year, and I was determined not to let the strange, unsettling atmosphere of the house ruin my plans. We'd spent weeks planning the party, and everything was set for a perfect night. I had invited my closest friends, Sarah, Sam, and Jenna, and we were going to have a sleepover after the party. It would be a night filled with movies, snacks, and laughter. Or so I thought. The day started off like any other. My mom made my favorite chocolate cake, and my dad helped me set up for the party. The house looked festive with streamers and balloons, and the large dining table was piled high with food and drink. As my friends arrived, I couldn't help but feel that sense of excitement I always got when a birthday came around. We were having a good time. It wasn't until later in the evening that things began to take a strange turn. Around 9 p.m., after we'd eaten cake and played a few rounds of charades, we all decided to head up to the attic for a game of truth or dare. The attic in our house was massive, dusty, filled with old furniture and forgotten trinkets from my dad's side of the family. It had always struck me as a little eerie, but my friends were eager to explore. We made our way up to the attic, the stairs creaking beneath our feet as we climbed, the air growing colder the higher we went. The attic was dimly lit, with just a few old lamps hanging from the ceiling. We sat down in a circle and began the game. It started innocently enough, with a few silly dares and harmless truths, but as the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy again, like something was watching us. I looked around at my friends. They were laughing, talking, and having fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the shadows of the attic, something that didn't belong. "You okay, Jess?" Sarah asked, noticing that I was no longer participating in the game. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a little tired." But that wasn't it. I wasn't tired. I felt as if the air in the attic had thickened, the silence in the corners pressing in on me. I tried to focus on the game, but then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible above the chatter. It was almost like a whisper coming from the far corner of the attic. I turned my head quickly, but there was no one there, just the empty darkness. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sam and Jenna exchanged puzzled looks, but Sarah just shrugged it off. "Probably just the wind, Jess. You know how old houses are." I wasn't so sure. The whisper didn't sound like wind. It felt intentional, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to speak. But no one was there. As the night wore on, my discomfort grew. We were all sitting in the middle of the attic when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. It was quick, just a fleeting moment, but it was enough to make my heart race. I tried to brush it off, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "We need to stop," I said, my voice unsteady. "Let's go back downstairs." "You're just spooked, Jess," Jenna teased. "We're fine. Just a few more minutes." I didn't argue, though I felt sick to my stomach. Something was wrong with this house, and it was becoming clear to me that whatever it was had been here long before we ever moved in. Suddenly, the attic light flickered. It wasn't the usual dimness of an old bulb. It flickered in a strange, rhythmic way, as if someone were turning it on and off. And then, the whispering came again, louder this time. The hair on my arms stood up. I felt the temperature in the room drop, a coldness that seemed to seep into my bones. I stood up, shaking. "We need to leave now." This time, Sarah and Sam must have seen the fear in my eyes. They jumped to their feet, and we rushed down the stairs. As we passed the landing at the top of the stairs, I looked back one last time toward the attic. And there, standing in the doorway of the attic, was a figure. A tall, dark shape, barely visible against the shadows. It had no face, just a silhouette that seemed to fade in and out of existence. "Did you see that?" I gasped, turning to my friends. They were already in the hallway, looking back at me, their faces pale. None of them had seen what I had, but the fear in my voice was enough to make them stop. "What is it, Jess?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I saw something in the attic," I whispered. "A figure. It was standing in the doorway." Sam shook his head. "Jess, there's nothing up there. Let's just go downstairs, okay? We're freaking ourselves out." I didn't say anything, but my mind raced. I knew what I had seen. It wasn't just my imagination. There was something in the house, something that didn't belong. We made our way down the stairs, and I was glad to be away from the attic, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. We settled in the living room, watching a movie, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I felt watched, like eyes were on me from every corner. At around midnight, we decided to call it a night and go to bed. My parents had already gone to sleep, so I knew we were on our own. My friends and I spread out in the living room on blankets and pillows, but no one could sleep. We kept hearing strange noises, footsteps in the hallway, the creaking of the old floorboards, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Finally, at 2 a.m., it happened. I was lying there, wide awake, staring at the dark ceiling when I heard it, clear as day. A voice, low and raspy, whispering my name. "Jessica." I froze, unable to move. The voice was coming from the hallway, but there was no one there. "Jessica." This time, the voice was closer, almost right next to me. I could feel the cold air brush against my face. I looked over at Sarah, but she was still sleeping soundly, her chest rising and falling steadily. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps coming down the hall toward the living room. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, grabbed my phone, and ran to my parents' room. I banged on the door, my heart racing. "Mom, Dad, there's something in the house." My dad opened the door, groggy and irritated, but when he saw the panic in my eyes, his expression changed. "What's going on, honey?" he asked, concern flooding his face. "There's something here, in the hallway. There's a voice, and it's following me. I can hear it moving." My dad blinked, then turned to my mom. "You hear that?" My mom, now awake, didn't respond immediately. She looked around the room and then back at me. "Jess, honey, I think it's time we told you the truth," she said softly. "The truth about what?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "The house," my dad said, his voice quiet but serious. "This house has a history. It's been in the family for generations, and there have been incidents over the years. Strange things, things that no one has ever been able to explain." "What kind of things?" I whispered. My mom sighed. "Voices, shadows, people who hear their names being called, but when they turn around there's no one there, and a figure that sometimes appears in the house." My heart sank. "The figure, it's the spirit of someone who died here," my dad said quietly. "I'm not sure who, but we've always known that this house isn't normal. It's been like that for years." That was all I needed to hear. I knew that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The rest of the night was a blur, but I remember how we all packed up my things the next day. My parents decided we would leave, at least for a while. They said they didn't want to scare me, but I knew the truth. The house was never ours to begin with. It belonged to whatever was still roaming its halls. To this day, I don't go near that house. It's still there, but I don't want to know what's inside. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was my 15th birthday, and I had been looking forward to it for months. My family had recently moved to an old house on the outskirts of town, a place that had been in my father's family for generations. I was excited about the party, the cake, and the small group of friends I had invited. But there was something about the house that unsettled me. It had an old charm to it, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and large rooms that were mostly empty, filled with dust-covered furniture and cobwebs. At night, it was even worse. There were strange sounds, scratching noises from the attic, whispering voices in the wind. My parents insisted it was just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had spent most of the day decorating for the party, blowing up balloons and setting up a table with snacks and drinks in the dining room. My friends, Carla and Jamie, arrived around 5. We spent the evening playing games, laughing, and eating cake. Everything seemed normal, and for the first time since we'd moved in, I almost felt at ease. That was until the night wore on and my friends left, and I found myself alone in the house once again. It was just past midnight when I realized the strange feeling I'd had about the house was more than just imagination. After everyone had gone home, my parents retired to their bedroom, and I was left to clean up the mess in the living room. As I worked, I noticed a strange noise coming from the attic. It was faint at first, like someone walking around upstairs, but as the noise grew louder, my heart started to race. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though someone was pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling again, but it continued for what felt like hours. I eventually gave in to my fear and decided to go upstairs to investigate. I stood at the bottom of the staircase, staring up into the darkness of the hallway. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, and I could hear the sound of my own breath echoing in the quiet house. When I reached the top, I turned toward the attic door, which was slightly ajar. The footsteps had stopped, and an eerie silence filled the space around me. My body was frozen with fear, but I forced myself to push open the door and step inside. The attic was cold, even for a late summer night, and the air smelled musty and old. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows against the walls. There was nothing in the attic but old boxes, forgotten furniture, and a few dusty sheets covering what I assumed were old belongings from previous generations. But then I saw something. In the far corner of the room, next to an old rocking chair, I noticed a figure. It was a tall, thin shape, just barely visible in the shadows. My heart stopped. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. The rocking chair, which had been moving ever so slightly a moment ago, was still now as if it had never been disturbed. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the corner where the figure had been. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned and fled down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I ran into my parents' room, but they were both asleep. I didn't know what to do. The house felt suffocating, as though something unseen was lurking around every corner, just waiting to make itself known. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was just tired from the party the night before. But the feeling lingered, like a heavy weight on my chest. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the attic, and I couldn't explain the coldness that seemed to settle in the air when I went upstairs. I decided to talk to my dad about it later, but when I did, he seemed unusually dismissive. "It's just an old house, Emma," he said, as though the thought of it being anything else was absurd. "You're just letting your imagination get the best of you. It's probably just the wind." But I knew better. I had never felt that way in any other house. There was something in that attic, something that had been there long before we moved in. The days passed, and the unease in the house grew. I started noticing things that hadn't been there before. Things out of place, objects that were moved when no one had touched them. My parents insisted it was just forgetfulness, but I wasn't so sure. I began to hear whispering voices in the middle of the night, soft and unintelligible, as if someone were speaking in another room. When I would get up to investigate, I would find nothing, but the voices would always return. Then came the night of my birthday. It was the weekend, and I had invited Carla and Jamie over for a sleepover. We were all excited, trying to push past the fear and unease I had been feeling. After the party, we decided to watch a horror movie in the living room and eat snacks until we were too tired to stay awake. But as the night wore on, the house seemed to grow quieter, the shadows stretching longer and darker across the walls. The whispering voices grew louder, echoing through the hallways. I glanced at my friends, but they didn't seem to notice. It was as if they couldn't hear it, as if it was meant for me alone. Around 2 a.m, Carla and Jamie fell asleep on the couch, their bodies curled up under blankets. I, however, couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the whispers, closer now, as if someone was standing just behind me, breathing in my ear. I turned to look, but there was no one there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and the weight of the air around me was suffocating. Suddenly, the attic door creaked open, and I felt a cold breeze wash over me. It was as though the house itself was exhaling, and I could sense something moving up there, something restless. My body froze. I didn't want to go up there again, not after what happened last time. But the urge to find out what was causing the noises was overwhelming. I slowly got up from the couch, trying not to disturb my sleeping friends, and I made my way up the stairs. The hallway was dark, save for the faint light coming from the attic. As I stood in front of the door, I could feel a presence behind it, waiting. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. The attic was exactly as it had been before, with its dusty furniture and forgotten objects. But this time, something was different. The rocking chair, which had been stationary the last time I saw it, was moving on its own now, rocking back and forth with a slow, rhythmic motion. My stomach churned, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I took a step forward, my heart racing in my chest. As I approached the rocking chair, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pale, lifeless face staring up at me from beneath the chair. It was the face of a woman, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth stretched in a grotesque smile. Her skin was ashen, almost translucent, and her hair was tangled and matted with dust. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The woman's smile grew wider, and I could hear the whispering voices again, clearer now, as though they were coming from her. I turned and ran, my legs almost giving out beneath me as I scrambled down the stairs. I didn't stop until I was outside, my heart hammering in my chest. The cold night air burned my lungs as I gasped for breath. The house loomed behind me, silent now, but I knew that whatever was in there, whatever had been in that attic, was still watching, waiting. My parents never believed me when I told them what happened that night. They said I had imagined it, that it was just a bad dream. But I knew what I saw. The house was haunted, It wasn't just the creaks of the old floorboards or the wind in the walls. There was something else there, something dark and restless. I left the house shortly after that night. I couldn't stay there any longer. I don't know what happened to the house after we moved out, but I'm sure the presence I felt in that attic is still there. I hope no one else ever has to experience what I did, but a part of me believes the house will never truly be empty. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was the summer of 2003 when my 16th birthday became the night I'll never forget. I had always looked forward to my birthday parties. My mom was fantastic at planning them, with a cake decorated like something straight out of a magazine and plenty of decorations. This year, however, things were different. We had just moved into a new house on the edge of town. It was an old place with tall windows and dark wood floors that creaked when you walked across them. It had always felt a little off to me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The house had been empty for a long time before we moved in. It was the kind of house that looked perfect on the outside, but felt heavy when you were inside. Still, I tried to push away the odd feeling I got every time I walked through its halls. It was the first time in years I'd be spending my birthday in a house that didn't feel familiar, and to make matters worse, we were still unpacking boxes when the big day came around. The party was scheduled for the evening, so I spent most of the day helping my mom prepare. We had invited a few friends from school, including Carla, my best friend since elementary school. We were both excited to finally have a house big enough to host a party. But even as I went about decorating the living room, something about the house was nagging at me. The house, especially the upstairs, always felt too quiet. Whenever I was alone there, I would hear things, whispers, faint footsteps behind me, the occasional flickering of lights. It made me uneasy, but I ignored it, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks on me. As evening approached and the guests began to arrive, the house seemed to lighten up. The laughter of my friends filled the air, and I was too busy greeting everyone to pay attention to the strange feeling I had earlier. The night went on without incident. We ate cake, played games, and took plenty of pictures. As the evening grew later, most of the guests headed home, leaving just me, Carla, and Jamie behind. That's when the strange events began. We were sitting in the living room, talking about the party and joking around when the doorbell rang. We all stared at each other, confused. I wasn't expecting anyone else. We had already said our goodbyes to everyone. Carla shrugged and stood up to answer the door, but when she opened it, there was no one there, just the quiet street and the darkened sky above. No car parked in front of the house, no sign of anyone lingering. It felt unsettling, but we brushed it off, thinking it was just some kids playing pranks. Maybe it was a neighbor, Jamie suggested, but no one had mentioned anything about stopping by. We locked the door and went back to the living room. But then the lights started flickering. It wasn't the usual kind of flickering, like when a bulb was about to burn out. No, this was different. The lights were flashing on and off as if someone was controlling them. I could hear the distinct sound of the light switch being flipped up and down, but when I checked, no one was near it. My heart raced in my chest as I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Something was definitely wrong. Carla suggested we go upstairs to the attic, which she thought would be a good place to investigate, though I wasn't so sure. I had always avoided the attic, mostly because of how cold it felt whenever I was near it. But my curiosity got the best of me, and we all decided to go up together. The stairs creaked as we made our way up to the second floor. The attic door was in the hallway, just across from my bedroom, and as we approached it, the temperature dropped noticeably. I could feel the chill on the back of my neck, and my skin prickled with a sense of unease. We stood there for a moment, staring at the old wooden door. The house was eerily quiet again, except for the occasional sound of wind rustling outside. I was about to reach for the handle when I saw it. Movement in the corner of my eye. I turned toward it quickly, but there was nothing there. My stomach tightened, and I felt the urge to run back downstairs, but something told me I had to go up to the attic. We couldn't just ignore it. With a deep breath, I opened the door. The attic was much colder than the rest of the house, and the dim light from the single bulb overhead cast long shadows across the room. The space was filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten trinkets from previous owners. But what caught my attention immediately was the old rocking chair in the corner. It was facing the wall, but what made it strange was that it was slowly rocking back and forth, as though someone had been sitting in it only moments before. "That's weird," Jamie said, her voice shaky. I felt a chill run down my spine. No one had been up here. We hadn't even opened the door until just now. I walked closer to the chair, my mind racing. As I got closer, the air around me seemed to grow heavier, suffocating, like something was pressing down on my chest. I looked down at the floor, where a small pile of dust had gathered, disturbed in a single path leading toward the far corner of the room. It looked like someone had been walking there. I couldn't take it anymore. I told Carla and Jamie that we needed to leave, but just as I turned to leave, I heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but then it grew louder, unmistakable. "Happy birthday, Emma." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was coming from the direction of the rocking chair, but when I looked, no one was there. The chair had stopped rocking, and the room felt impossibly cold. My breath came out in visible clouds, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Carla nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, I did. It sounded like someone was in here with us." I had never felt fear like this before. Every instinct in my body was screaming for me to run, but I couldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot as if something was holding me there. The voice, soft and soothing yet laced with something sinister, repeated, "Happy birthday, Emma," one last time. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath again. The entire attic seemed to darken as if the shadows themselves were coming to life. I finally found the strength to turn and run, with Jamie and Carla close behind. We bolted down the stairs, not looking back. Once we were downstairs, we locked all the doors and windows, and I insisted that we call my parents. My mom didn't believe us, of course, and my dad just blamed it on the old house settling. But none of us could shake the feeling that something had been in that attic with us. Something that had been waiting for me. For weeks after the incident, I had nightmares about that night, about the voice that had spoken to me. I couldn't shake the image of the empty rocking chair, gently rocking back and forth as though inviting me to sit. I didn't want to believe that the house was haunted, but the events of that night made it impossible to ignore. To this day, I don't know what it was. But every year as my birthday rolls around, I can't help but remember the voice that greeted me in the attic. "Happy birthday, Emma."
Story number 5.
It was my 18th birthday, the year I had been looking forward to for months. I had never made much of a fuss over birthdays, but this year felt different. Maybe it was the milestone of becoming an adult, or perhaps it was the fact that my parents had just bought an old house in the countryside. I had always loved this house, even though there was something about it that unsettled me. It was large and imposing, the kind of house you'd see in horror movies, with creaking floorboards and a sprawling yard that seemed to stretch for miles. But despite its slightly eerie atmosphere, I was excited to spend my birthday there, surrounded by family and friends. The day started out like any other birthday. I woke up to the smell of pancakes and bacon, the table set with balloons and streamers. My parents were already in high spirits, and I could tell my mom had spent hours preparing. She was always the life of the party, making sure everything was perfect. This year, she had even arranged for a small gathering at the house, inviting a few close friends and relatives. It was going to be a quiet celebration, no big blowout, but just enough to make the day special. As the guests arrived, I began to feel the excitement building. The house felt alive with energy, filled with laughter and chatter. But as the evening wore on, I started to feel a strange sensation creeping over me. It wasn't anything I could explain, but it felt like something was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling, especially when I walked through certain parts of the house, like the upstairs hallway or the darkened corners of the living room. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the nerves that came with being the center of attention on my birthday. It wasn't until later that night that things started to take a turn. The party had died down by around 10 p.m. The guests were starting to leave, and my parents were cleaning up in the kitchen. I was standing by the window, looking out over the yard when I heard a noise. It was a soft creaking, like someone was walking upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. It was an old place, after all. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more deliberate. My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward the staircase, but no one was there. My parents were downstairs, and the last of the guests had left. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the longer I stood there, the more uneasy I became. The sound wasn't just creaking anymore. It was footsteps, slow and steady, as though someone was walking across the floor above me. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't ignore the rising sense of dread that flooded over me. I went to the bottom of the stairs and called out, "Mom? Dad? Is anyone up there?" No response. The house was eerily quiet. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the best of me. I started to climb the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath. When I reached the top, I turned toward the hallway. The light was dim, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every flicker of the bulb. I called out again, but this time there was no answer. As I walked down the hall, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was almost suffocating. My skin prickled, and I had to fight the urge to turn back. There was something about the atmosphere in that hallway that felt wrong, unnatural even. The house was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I reached the end of the hall where the guest room was located. The door was slightly ajar, and as I peered inside, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then, the door slowly creaked open wider, as though someone on the other side had nudged it just a little bit. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Mom?" I whispered, but there was no reply. I slowly stepped forward, my mind racing. What was going on? The door swung open fully now, revealing the dimly lit room. There was nothing in there. No one. I was beginning to feel like I was losing my mind, but I couldn't dismiss the fact that something felt very wrong. Just as I was about to leave the room, I heard something faint. Whispers. Soft, unintelligible words drifting from somewhere deep within the house. My heart raced as I turned around, scanning the room. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't coming from outside the room, but from within it. The whispers grew clearer and more distinct. "Happy birthday." The voice was faint, like it was coming from behind the walls, but it was unmistakable. I felt a rush of cold air sweep over me, and I spun around in panic. The room was empty. There was no one there. I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers had stopped, but I could still hear them in my head. I didn't know what to do. I ran down the stairs and found my parents in the kitchen, still cleaning up. I told them about the voices, the footsteps, the strange feeling in the house, but they laughed it off. My dad joked that the house was settling, and that I was just spooked because of the excitement. My mom, always the skeptic, dismissed it as my imagination running wild, but I couldn't forget what I had heard. That voice. It had been so clear, so real. And it wasn't just the voice, it was the feeling that followed me. I couldn't shake the oppressive weight in the air, the suffocating sense of being watched. Something was in the house with us, and I wasn't sure what it wanted. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I tried to enjoy my birthday, but the unease lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. My parents went to bed around midnight, and I stayed up, wide-eyed, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. I heard the whispers again, this time faint but unmistakable. "Happy birthday, Emma." I jumped up, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I grabbed my jacket and ran outside into the cool night air, desperate for some relief. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the yard. I stood there for a long time, trying to calm my breathing. I didn't know what had happened that night, but I knew I couldn't go back into that house. I ended up spending the night at Carla's house, and when I told her about what happened, she didn't believe me. She said it was probably just the stress of the birthday, or the old house playing tricks on me. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew what I felt. In the weeks that followed, things only got worse. I would hear the whispers on occasion, the soft voice wishing me a happy birthday. But it wasn't just on my birthday. It was any time I was alone in the house. It was as though the spirit, or whatever it was trying to get my attention. I eventually convinced my parents to leave the house for good, citing the constant strange occurrences. We moved into a new place, one that was closer to town, and I never heard the voice again. But I couldn't forget what happened. The whispers, the cold air, the feeling of being watched. And every year on my birthday, I can still hear it, faint but clear in my mind. Happy birthday, Emma. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was my 18th birthday, and everything was supposed to go perfectly. I had spent the entire summer anticipating this day. Being an adult in the eyes of the world, it was a milestone. My parents had moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, and though the house had its charm, there was something about it that made my skin crawl. Perhaps it was the way the creaky floorboards would groan underfoot, or the lingering smell of old wood that seemed to hang in the air, or the fact that we had bought the house at such a low price. I had gotten used to the odd things happening in the house, lights flickering, strange noises in the middle of the night, that sense of being watched even when I was alone. But none of it had ever felt overtly menacing. It was just a part of living in an old house, I thought. Or at least, that's what I convinced myself of. My birthday came, and my parents had promised me a simple celebration with a few friends, a homemade cake, and dinner. My best friend, Sarah, was coming over, and I was excited to show her the new house. It was big, enough to give us space to entertain and explore. The evening started off wonderfully. The party was lively, everyone was in good spirits, and my mom had outdone herself with the food. It felt like a perfect birthday, nothing out of the ordinary. Everyone sang happy birthday, and the laughter filled the air. But as the night wore on and people started to leave, the atmosphere in the house began to change. It became quieter, the warmth of the celebration fading into the background. Sarah was staying the night with me, as she had done many times before. We spent hours talking in my room, giggling, and looking through old family albums. But that night, there was something different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was hard to pinpoint, but it was there, tugging at the edges of my awareness. At around 11 p.m., after everyone had left, we decided to explore the house. We were tired, but curious. The house had 3 floors, and we'd barely explored the top floor. My parents' bedroom was at the very top of the house, tucked away in the farthest corner. The stairs leading up there creaked as if they hadn't been used in years. The floorboards groaned with every step, and the hallway above was dimly lit by a single bulb. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. I paused, straining my ears. It sounded like something faint, like the soft scraping of furniture across the floor, or maybe footsteps, but it was too quiet to be sure. "I think it's just the house settling," I said, trying to sound calm. I didn't want to admit that I had heard it too. The house was old, and the walls were thick with age. Every creak, every groan was to be expected. Still, something about it felt different tonight. We continued up the stairs, the air growing colder as we neared the top. When we reached the hallway, we saw it, a closed door at the end of the hall. It led into an unused room, one my parents had never even mentioned. I had walked past that door countless times, but it had never stood out before. The door was ajar now, slightly open, as if inviting us in. "You go first," Sarah whispered, clearly a little uneasy. I knew she felt it too, that odd weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. I hesitated but couldn't resist. My curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped forward, pushing the door open with a slow creak. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the hallway behind us. I could barely make out the shape of old furniture piled in the center of the room, covered in dust sheets. But there was something else, something about the room that felt wrong. The air was thick, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Yet, I could have sworn I smelled something faintly sweet, like flowers or perfume. I stepped in, and as soon as my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang. My heart skipped in my chest as I turned around, startled. I reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it was stuck. "Sarah?" I called out, panic rising in my chest. There was no answer. I turned to look back into the room, trying to focus on the growing sense of dread that filled my chest. Suddenly, I felt cold hands brush against my neck, like a whisper of air, but too real, too intentional. A chill ran through me, and my entire body went rigid. "Happy birthday." The voice came from behind me, faint but unmistakable. I spun around, expecting to see Sarah, but she wasn't there. The room was empty, just the old furniture and the dust that had settled over everything. My blood ran cold. That voice, it wasn't Sarah's. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached for the door again, now desperate, and this time it opened easily, as though nothing had happened. Sarah was standing on the other side, her face pale and wide-eyed. I heard it too, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't want to say anything, but it was like someone was talking to us. But no one was here. I grabbed her hand and pulled her down the stairs, not looking back. We reached the living room where my parents were still cleaning up, oblivious to what had just happened. I sat down on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. "What's wrong?" my mom asked, noticing my pale face. "I heard something," I said, trying to explain, but my words felt weak, as though I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. A voice. It said, "Happy birthday." My mom just looked at me like I was imagining things. "It's just an old house, sweetie. You're probably just spooked from the party." But I wasn't imagining it. I knew what I heard, and I knew what I felt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the words echoing in my mind. "Happy birthday." I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the house, but it didn't feel that way. There was something more to it. Something. Waiting. The next morning, I went upstairs to the room, hoping to find something that could explain what happened. I opened the door and stepped in again. The room felt just as cold, just as heavy, but there was no trace of anything unusual. No voice, no eerie presence, just an abandoned space full of dust. But as I was leaving, I noticed something strange. A small, faded photograph on the floor near the door. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It was an old black and white picture, showing a family standing in front of the house, smiling. I recognized the house in the background. It was the same one we had moved into, though the photo had to have been taken decades ago. But it was the woman in the picture that caught my attention. She was standing in the back, her face pale, with an unsettling smile on her lips. And in her hands, she held a bouquet of flowers, almost like she was presenting them to the camera. A chill ran down my spine. It was the same sweet floral scent I had smelled in the room the night before, and in the corner of the photo, just barely visible, was the date, 1957. I dropped the photograph, my heart racing. That voice, those words, I realized then that it hadn't been a coincidence. The house wasn't just old. It was haunted. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I never went back into that room again, and for the next few weeks, I tried to ignore the feeling that something or someone was watching me. I couldn't shake the connection between the photo, the voice, and the date. Whoever that woman was, I felt certain she had something to do with the house. And with me. Every year, on my birthday, I feel the presence again. I can't explain it, but I know it's there, lingering in the house. I've since moved out, but the memory of that voice, that cold touch, will forever stay with me. Happy birthday. Story the end.
Story number 7.
My birthday had always been a time of excitement and joy. Growing up, my family made sure each celebration was special, filled with laughter, cake, and presents. But this year, my 22nd birthday was different. It wasn't the usual celebration. It would be a day that I would never forget, and I wish I could say it was for all the right reasons. It started like any other birthday. The sun was bright, and I woke up to a warm cup of coffee from my mother. I had recently moved into a small, old house on the outskirts of town. The house was a fixer-upper, but I loved it. It had so much character, with its creaky floors, ancient wallpaper, and large windows that let in the light. My parents were helping me get settled in, and though they had their concerns about the house's age, they supported me. The house had always felt strange, but I never paid much attention to it. The old stairs would creak when no one was walking on them, and the wind would rattle the windows, making strange sounds in the middle of the night. I just assumed that was normal for an old house. My friends, however, always seemed to get uneasy when they visited, mentioning how the house had a vibe, but I just shrugged it off. On the morning of my birthday, the house felt different. There was an odd chill in the air, even though the weather outside was warm. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. My friends were coming over later that evening, and I planned on hosting a simple dinner with cake and wine. I was excited, but I couldn't quite get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. As the day passed, the house seemed to get quieter. At around 7 p.m., my friends started arriving. They brought gifts, cards, and most importantly, their energy, which was a relief after the unsettling feelings I had been experiencing. We ate, laughed, and celebrated, and for a while, I was able to forget about the unease that had been building inside me all day. But as the night went on, things started to feel off again. It wasn't just the house being unusually silent, it was the way the temperature kept shifting. One moment it was warm and comfortable, and the next it felt like a cold draft was sweeping through the rooms. My friends didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. At one point, I went upstairs to grab something from my bedroom. As I was walking down the hallway, I heard something behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. It was a soft sound, footsteps slow and deliberate, coming from the stairwell at the end of the hallway. I turned around, half expecting to see someone there, but no one was there. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me, so I brushed it off. I was just getting older, I told myself. Maybe I was imagining things. As the evening went on, I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. My friends were still downstairs, chatting and having a good time, but I kept hearing faint sounds from the upper floors. More footsteps, soft whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I checked the windows to make sure no one was outside, but they were shut tight and there was no one to be seen. It was when we were sitting around the table, enjoying cake and talking, that the moment happened. My best friend, Emily, who had been with me since we were kids, looked at me strangely. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice low. I looked at her, confused. "What do you mean? You just look off, like you're somewhere else," she said, glancing nervously toward the stairs. I turned and looked as well, and my heart nearly stopped. At the top of the stairs, standing in the shadow of the hallway, was a figure. It was tall, cloaked in dark shadows, but I could just make out the shape of a person. An outline of someone standing perfectly still, watching us. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emily looked over at me, then back toward the figure. When she saw it too, her face went pale, and she grabbed my arm. "Who's up there?" she whispered urgently, but the room had grown too quiet, the laughter and music from earlier fading into the background. The figure didn't move, it just stood there. Its presence heavy in the air, it felt wrong, unwelcoming and cold. It was as if the air in the room had thickened, making it hard to breathe. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, no movement. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Emily pulled me away from the table, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm getting out of here," she said, her voice tight with panic. I nodded, but my legs felt frozen. My mind was racing. That figure, whatever it was, wasn't human. I knew it. I could feel it. It wasn't just the shadow, it was the presence that came with it. The overwhelming sense of dread, like something that didn't belong, was invading our space. I didn't want to go upstairs, but I had to know what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight, and Emily reluctantly followed me. We tiptoed up the stairs, the floorboards creaking under our weight. As we reached the top, the hallway seemed darker than I remembered. The figure had disappeared, but I knew it hadn't left. It was still there, somewhere. I stepped forward, my hands shaking as I held the flashlight in front of me. Suddenly, the door to my bedroom creaked open on its own. I jumped back, startled. Emily gasped beside me, clutching my arm. There was no wind, no reason for the door to move. It was just open. I didn't want to go in, but I felt like I had no choice. We slowly walked toward the door, and as we entered the room, the temperature dropped even further. My breath misted in front of me as though it was winter. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw something. Something on the bed. It was an old, dusty photo album. I hadn't left it there. I hadn't even seen it before. My hands trembled as I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened it slowly, the pages yellowed with age. And as I flipped through the album, I found something chilling. It was a picture of a family, standing in front of a house. This house. The family looked happy, smiling, their faces full of life, but in the background, barely visible, was a woman. She wasn't smiling like the others. Instead, her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were dark, vacant, staring right at the camera. I slammed the album shut, my hands shaking. I turned to Emily, my voice barely a whisper. We need to get out of here, now. We didn't even stop to grab our things. We ran downstairs, straight out the door. I didn't look back. The house had changed. It wasn't the same place I had moved into. Something was there, and it wasn't just the house. It was something that had been waiting for a long time. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go back. I packed my things and stayed at a friend's place for a while. That night, I left the house for good. I don't know what I saw that night, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't just a birthday scare. The house was haunted. The figure I saw, the woman in the photo, and the whispers on my birthday, they were all connected. To this day, I never stepped foot in that house again. Happy birthday, I still hear sometimes in my dreams. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
It was the week of Sarah's birthday, and she was looking forward to celebrating with her closest friends and family. Her parents had moved to an old house in the countryside a year ago, and although Sarah had grown accustomed to the creaks and groans of the aging wood, there were things about the house that still unsettled her. The house, a grand old Victorian with dark wooden floors and a towering staircase, had a history that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. When they first moved in, Sarah's mother had told her that the house had been vacant for several years after the last owners had mysteriously disappeared. The locals never spoke of the family who had once lived there, and no one seemed to remember much about them. Still, Sarah's mom assured her that it was just an old, quiet house, nothing to worry about. But Sarah felt differently. Her birthday was on the 19th of January, and she had been planning the party for weeks. She had invited her closest friends from school, as well as her cousins, and they would all gather in the grand dining room for cake, games, and the usual birthday festivities. But as the date drew closer, Sarah began to feel a subtle change in the atmosphere of the house. It was like a heaviness in the air, a feeling of something watching her. The shadows seemed to move differently around her, like they weren't quite in sync with the daylight. A day before her birthday, Sarah sat on the couch in the living room, lost in thought. The air felt colder than usual, and she pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders. Her mother had gone out to pick up the birthday cake, and her father was in the study working on some documents. It was quiet. Too quiet. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft tapping. It came from upstairs, in the hallway just outside the room where Sarah kept her things. She paused, listening. It was subtle, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was tapping on the floor above. It wasn't like a creak from the house settling. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone was walking slowly across the floor. Sarah's heart began to race. She had heard strange sounds before in this house, shifting furniture, faint whispers at night, but nothing quite like this. She stood up and walked cautiously toward the staircase, listening intently. The tapping continued, slow and measured, each tap sending a ripple of dread through her chest. When she reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. She hesitated at the landing, looking down the long corridor that led to the rooms. It was dark, despite the afternoon sun filtering through the curtains. Sarah glanced over at the door to her own room. The faint tapping had come from just beyond that door. Swallowing hard, she approached the door and gently turned the handle. The room was empty. Nothing was out of place. Her clothes hung in the closet, her bed was neatly made, and the light from the window cast a soft glow on the floor. Yet the air in the room felt thick, unnaturally thick, and Sarah could sense an overwhelming presence, as if someone was standing just out of sight, waiting. She quickly closed the door and retreated down the hall, her mind racing. The tapping had been real, but what had caused it? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, Sarah tried to push the strange events from her mind. It was her birthday, after all, and she didn't want to let it ruin her celebration. When her friends and family arrived later that afternoon, the house was filled with laughter and music. The children ran up and down the staircase while the adults mingled and chatted over hors d'oeuvres. But as the evening wore on, Sarah's unease grew. The tapping had returned, this time coming from the same hallway upstairs. It was faint at first, but as the night progressed, it grew louder, as if someone was pacing the hall just outside her room. Sarah tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the festivities downstairs. but she couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was watching her. Every time she glanced up, the hallway seemed darker, the shadows deeper. As the night drew to a close, Sarah's friends began to leave. Her cousins had already gone, and soon only a few people remained. Her parents were in the kitchen cleaning up, leaving Sarah alone in the dimly lit living room. The tapping had returned, louder than ever. It was relentless, echoing down the hall like a slow march toward her. Her breath caught in her throat as she glanced toward the staircase. The hall was empty. There was no one there, but the tapping continued, the sound unmistakable. It was as if someone was walking just beyond her sight, waiting for her to notice. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, Sarah made her way up the stairs once again, heart pounding. This time, she was determined to confront whatever was causing the disturbance. She reached the top and walked down the hall toward her room. The tapping had stopped. The air was still and silent, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob, and she slowly turned it. The room was dark, the shadows long and heavy. But when she stepped inside, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The floor was covered in dust, but there in the middle of the room was a faint impression of footprints. Damp, muddy prints, as though someone had been walking across the floor. But she had been the only one in the room all day. Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that knocked her to the ground. She screamed and scrambled to her feet, her pulse racing. The room was colder now, and she could see her breath misting in the air. A faint whisper filled the room, soft and unintelligible, but there was no mistaking the malice in the tone. Sarah turned toward the window, desperate to escape, but the curtains began to move on their own, swirling as though an invisible force was at work. The whispering grew louder, a low growl now, and she realized with horror that it was not just one voice. There were many, all speaking in unison. Suddenly, the door flew open, and Sarah stumbled backward, her heart nearly stopping in her chest. Standing in the doorway was a figure, pale and gaunt, its face twisted in an expression of eternal sorrow. Its eyes were wide and empty, as if staring into nothingness. It stepped forward, its feet making no sound on the floor, and as it moved closer, Sarah felt the air grow even colder, the pressure in her chest tightening. "Leave. Leave this house," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping whisper that made Sarah's skin crawl. Tears filled her eyes as she backed away, but the figure followed, its presence suffocating. The shadows seemed to reach out, pulling at her, urging her to stay, but she couldn't. She had to leave. With a cry of terror, Sarah turned and ran down the hall, down the stairs, and out the front door. The night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop running. She ran until she reached the edge of the property, gasping for breath. Her birthday had become a nightmare, one she would never forget. The next morning, Sarah's parents found her sitting on the front steps, pale and trembling. She didn't speak of what had happened, but they knew something was wrong. The house felt different after that night, empty, lifeless, as if something had been awakened, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. From that day on, Sarah never celebrated another birthday in that house. The tapping never stopped, and no matter where she went, she could never shake the feeling that the house was still watching her, waiting for her to return. Story the end.
Story number 9.
When Lily turned 12, she thought she knew exactly what to expect. Her family had lived in the same house for years, a cozy, slightly worn cottage on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was home. The walls, though creaky, were filled with the memories of family dinners, late-night conversations, and the laughter of children. Her parents, a little worn out from work, promised a small but memorable birthday party with a few friends and cake, just as they did every year. Lily's birthday fell on the 19th of January, a chilly, crisp winter day. The sky was overcast, the streets covered with a light dusting of snow. Her friends from school were coming over after school for games and cake, and though she was excited, there was a strange feeling she couldn't shake, a gnawing sensation at the back of her mind, something unsettling, like a distant whisper in a room full of noise. It wasn't the house that scared her. She'd grown up in it, after all. It was the feeling that something was different this year. The odd sensation started the night before her birthday. As she was brushing her teeth in the bathroom, She thought she saw a figure in the reflection of the mirror, a shadow that wasn't her own. When she turned to look, nothing was there, but the feeling lingered, like eyes were watching her every move. That evening, her parents had made a delicious dinner of spaghetti and meatballs, and the table was full of warmth and laughter. But when the last of the dishes were cleared away, Lily's father, Tom, left to check something in the basement. Her mother, Sarah, continued to tidy up the kitchen while Lily helped set up the living room for the party. As she worked, she noticed that the room seemed darker than usual, the shadows under the furniture stretching long across the floor. She shook it off, just her imagination running wild. After all, she was excited about the party. The clock struck 10 p.m., and Lily's friends had just left, all smiles and promises to call tomorrow. She felt a rush of joy as the day came to a close. But when she was about to head upstairs to bed, she heard it. A soft thud from upstairs. At first, she thought it was her father coming back from the basement, but the sound was too soft, almost as if it were coming from the attic. Curious, she made her way up the stairs, her footsteps careful on the creaky wooden floorboards. The house was unusually quiet, too quiet. She reached the bottom of the attic stairs, the door to the space slightly ajar, though they never opened it. Her parents had told her that the attic was full of old boxes and dusty furniture, a place where they stored things they didn't need. The noise came again, a faint thud, almost like footsteps. Lily swallowed hard. She wasn't sure why, but she felt compelled to climb the stairs. Her hand trembled as she pushed open the attic door, the old hinges creaking in protest. The room was shrouded in shadows, but she could make out the outlines of old furniture covered in dusty sheets. It smelled of mildew and time. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive, as if the air itself was thick with something she couldn't name. As she stepped inside, the air seemed to shift, and the thudding noise came once more, but louder now. It was coming from the far corner of the attic. She couldn't see anything, just dark shapes in the gloom, but she could feel the presence of something or someone just beyond her sight. She froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached for the light switch, but before she could touch it, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Lily turned to leave, but before she could take a step, she saw it. A small, old-fashioned music box, sitting on an overturned box in the corner. She had never seen it before, yet something about it felt familiar, as though it had been waiting for her. The box was delicately carved, with intricate floral patterns etched into the wood. But it wasn't the design that made her stomach churn. It was the fact that it was open. Inside, the music box played a soft, eerie tune, a lullaby she vaguely recognized but couldn't place. It was the same tune her grandmother used to hum when Lily was a little girl, though her grandmother had passed away years ago. Lily's heart raced. She reached for the music box, intending to close it, but as her fingers brushed the edge, the attic door slammed shut behind her with a force that made the house tremble. The sound of the slam echoed through the room, as though the house itself had let out a heavy breath. She turned back toward the door, her mind racing. The knob was cold to the touch, and no matter how hard she tried to twist it, it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. Suddenly, the temperature in the attic dropped, and Lily could see her breath fogging in the air. The music box played on, the soft lullaby spinning in circles, though the melody was distorted now, like someone was turning the dial too quickly. The lights flickered and then went out entirely, plunging her into darkness. She stood frozen, listening to the faint creaking of the floorboards, the whisper of wind moving through the cracks in the attic, and then a voice, soft like a whisper in her ear. "Lily?" Her blood ran cold. The voice was faint, almost drowned by the sound of the wind, but she heard it clear as day. Her name. The attic felt alive with a presence, something ancient, something that shouldn't have been there. Lily's chest tightened as she fumbled for the light switch again, but before she could flip it, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. The pressure on her shoulder vanished, and the music box began to play faster, more erratic, as if it were alive, pulling her deeper into its melody. Without thinking, Lily scrambled to her feet and ran for the door again, panic flooding her veins. She pounded on the door, shouting for her parents, but no sound escaped her lips. Her throat was dry, constricted with fear. The house felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing in from all sides. And then, in the farthest corner of the attic, she saw it. An old rocking chair, its seat swaying slightly as though someone had just risen from it. Lily's breath caught in her throat. A figure sat in the chair, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light. "Happy birthday, Lily," the figure whispered, its voice low and rasping. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes as she turned and bolted for the stairs. She stumbled, her legs weak with fear, but somehow she managed to make it to the top of the attic stairs. As she ran down, the door behind her slammed open, the wind howling through the attic. Lily didn't stop to look back. She burst into her parents' room, gasping for air. Her father, now awake, looked at her with concern, but Lily could barely speak. She pointed to the stairs, her body shaking violently, but when her father went to check, there was nothing. The attic was empty, the music box silent. Lily didn't sleep that night. Her birthday party was over, but the terror lingered. The next morning, when the sun rose and the house seemed calm again, Lily's parents tried to comfort her. But Lily couldn't shake the image of the figure in the rocking chair, the voice that had whispered her name. Years passed, and the memory of that night faded into the back of Lily's mind. But every year on her birthday, she couldn't help but glance nervously at the attic door. The music box, she later learned, had belonged to her great-grandmother. It was said to be a family heirloom passed down through generations, but it wasn't the heirloom Lily feared. It was the presence in the house, the thing that had waited for her, watched her, and whispered her name on her 12th birthday. And so every year, as her birthday approached, Lily would sit in her room, waiting for the inevitable feeling that something was wrong, that something would call her name again.
Story number 10.
It was the week leading up to Emma's 16th birthday, and she couldn't have been more excited. She had been dreaming of this day for months. Her sweet 16 was supposed to be perfect. The party would be filled with her closest friends, fancy decorations, and the biggest cake she'd ever seen. Her parents, who normally preferred quiet evenings, were going all out for this one. Their home was a charming old house nestled at the edge of a small town, one that Emma had grown up in. It had been in the family for generations, passed down from her great-grandparents. Though the house had an old-world charm, there was always something strange about it. The walls creaked, the floors groaned with every step, and sometimes at night, Emma would hear whispers when no one was around. She often tried to ignore the unsettling atmosphere, chalking it up to the house's age, but there was always a sense of something else. It was like the house was alive, as if it remembered the people who had lived there before, their laughter, their sorrow, and the memories they left behind. That particular week, Emma was preparing for the big event. She spent hours decorating the living room with balloons and streamers while her mother baked cupcakes and cupcakes. But as the big day approached, Emma noticed something odd. On the night of the 17th, the night before her birthday, she had a vivid dream. It was about her grandmother who had passed away when Emma was very young. Her grandmother had been a warm, kind woman who had always told Emma strange stories about the house, stories about the old family that once lived there before them, stories that were full of mystery and eeriness. In Emma's dream, she was in the living room of the house, surrounded by soft candlelight. Her grandmother stood in front of her, smiling, but there was something in her eyes, a sadness, a warning. She whispered, "You must never open the old trunk in the attic. It's not for you to touch." Emma woke up with a jolt, her heart pounding. The room felt heavy, as if the dream had followed her into the waking world. She shook her head, trying to forget about it, but the message lingered in her mind. Her grandmother had always spoken in riddles, but why had the warning about the trunk come to her now, just before her birthday? As the day of her birthday arrived, Emma pushed the dream to the back of her mind. Her friends arrived in the afternoon, ready for a day of fun and laughter. The house filled with energy, the walls echoing with voices, music, and the sound of people celebrating. Emma's parents were beaming with pride as they watched their daughter in the spotlight, glowing with excitement and happiness. However, as night fell and the party wound down, Emma found herself feeling strangely uneasy. She couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, as if she was being watched. Her friends had all gone home, and her parents were cleaning up the remains of the party. She wandered into the living room, sitting down on the couch, trying to relax. That's when she heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper coming from upstairs. It was the sound of soft footsteps, followed by the unmistakable creak of a door opening. Emma froze. Her parents were downstairs, so there was no one up there, but the sound was unmistakable. She had heard it before, the creaks and groans of the house. But tonight, they felt different. Her curiosity got the best of her. She stood up, her heart racing, and walked toward the stairs. The hallway leading to the attic was dark, the shadows stretching long along the walls. Emma paused at the bottom of the stairs, her breath shallow. The attic door was slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light escaping from the crack. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind, never open the old trunk in the attic. Emma didn't know why, but something drew her toward the attic that night. She knew she shouldn't go up there. She knew it was a bad idea, but the pull was irresistible. She slowly ascended the stairs, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top of the stairs, the door to the attic stood ajar, just as she had seen in her dream. She pushed it open, and the scent of dust and old wood hit her immediately. The attic was exactly as she had remembered it, filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten treasures. It was a place that held memories of past generations, the remnants of lives long gone. But there, in the far corner of the room, sat the trunk. It was an old wooden chest, worn with age, its brass handles tarnished with time. The trunk was covered in a layer of dust, but something about it seemed to draw her in. She walked toward it, her steps hesitant, and without thinking she knelt down to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the trunk, she felt a sudden chill. The room seemed to darken, and the air grew colder, heavier. The whispering began again, this time louder and clearer. It was coming from inside the trunk. "Emma," the voice whispered, calling her name. "You should not have come." The voice was low and raspy, like the sound of someone trying to speak through a veil. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. Her grandmother's warning flashed in her mind again, but it was too late. The trunk began to creak open on its own, the hinges groaning in protest. Emma backed away, her body trembling with fear. As the lid opened further, the darkness inside seemed to swirl, as though something was moving within. She felt a sudden pressure in her chest, like the air had thickened around her and she couldn't breathe. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the trunk, pale, ghostly, and translucent. The figure was of a woman, her face obscured by long, dark hair. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her arms reaching out toward Emma. The woman's voice echoed through the attic, filling the room with a cold, suffocating presence. "It's your time now," the figure said, its voice a hollow whisper. "You were chosen." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. The figure's cold fingers brushed against her skin, sending a jolt of icy terror through her. It was as if the very air around her had frozen solid, trapping her in place. Just as the figure's hand was about to touch her face, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The figure vanished, and the coldness lifted, leaving Emma gasping for breath. The trunk slowly creaked shut on its own, as if nothing had ever happened. She stumbled back, nearly falling as she rushed to the door. She fumbled with the doorknob, her hands shaking uncontrollably. When the door finally opened, she rushed downstairs, not daring to look back. Her parents were in the kitchen, talking quietly, unaware of what had just transpired. Emma couldn't explain what she had seen or felt. She couldn't make sense of it, but she knew one thing for certain. Something had awoken in that attic, something that had been waiting for her. Her grandmother's warning had been real, and now she understood why. She wasn't meant to open that trunk, but it was too late. As the night went on, Emma sat in her room, staring at the door, waiting for the feeling to pass. She kept hearing soft whispers, faint as a breeze, but growing louder and closer. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ghostly woman's face, her cold fingers reaching for Emma's skin. And as the clock struck midnight, Emma realized the truth. Her birthday wasn't meant to be a celebration at all. It was the anniversary of something far darker, something that had been tied to the house for generations, something that had waited all these years. Story end.
Story number 11.
Lena had always loved her birthday. The excitement of the day had been a constant for as long as she could remember. Every year, her family would gather to celebrate, the house filled with laughter, decorations, and delicious food. Her 21st birthday was no different, and she looked forward to it eagerly. The date, December 14th, was special not just because it was her birthday, but because it marked another year of her life in her childhood home, the house her parents had bought when they were newlyweds. It had seen her grow up, watched her through the milestones, and held countless memories. But this year, there was something different. Lena couldn't quite place her finger on it, but she felt an unease settling in her chest as the day approached. It was a faint feeling, something almost imperceptible, like a low hum vibrating through the air. She chalked it up to the stress of final exams and the excitement of the party. After all, it was a big birthday for her, turning 21, finally an adult in the eyes of the world. But the weight of the strange feeling followed her all the same. It was late in the evening on her birthday when the first incident occurred. The party had been in full swing for hours, the house buzzing with friends, family, and music. Lena was surrounded by familiar faces, but something caught her attention: the shadows in the corners of the room. For a split second, as she laughed and chatted with friends, she thought she saw someone standing by the door, just out of sight. A woman with long dark hair, standing still as if waiting for something. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Lena shrugged it off, thinking it was just her imagination playing tricks on her in the dim light. She turned her attention back to the conversation, but as the evening wore on, that feeling of being watched crept in again, the air heavy with something unspoken. The house seemed colder than usual, and there were small noises, a door creaking, a glass clinking, sounds that didn't fit with the rhythm of the party. Later that evening, when the guests had left and her parents went to bed, Lena found herself in the kitchen cleaning up the remains of the cake and snacks. The house, once alive with the sounds of laughter and music, was now eerily quiet. The silence pressed in around her. She was tired, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't let her rest. She felt like there was something she was forgetting, something she should have known. That's when she heard it. A soft thud coming from upstairs. Lena froze, her heart skipping a beat. The house had always creaked, and sometimes the floors would groan in the night, but this sound was different. It was deliberate, like something or someone was moving upstairs. Her first thought was that it was just the house settling. But then she remembered. The attic. Her parents had warned her about the attic. It wasn't so much a warning as a passing mention, "Don't go up there. It's just filled with old stuff." But every time she had tried to ask them about it, they would always brush it off. They rarely spoke about the attic. It wasn't a part of the house they used. But tonight, that sound was undeniable. The thud was followed by a faint scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. Lena's pulse quickened. She hadn't heard anything like it before, and it felt too deliberate to be the house settling. It was something else. Grabbing a flashlight from a drawer, she slowly made her way toward the staircase. The beam of light flickered as she climbed, casting long, strange shadows on the walls. When she reached the top of the stairs, the house felt unnervingly still. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for the door to the attic. It was slightly ajar, just enough to allow a sliver of light to seep through. She pushed the door open, the old wood groaning in protest. The attic was dark, save for the beam of light from her flashlight. She stepped inside, her footfalls muffled by the dusty floorboards. The air smelled stale, like old books and forgotten memories. There were boxes stacked high, furniture covered in faded sheets, and piles of things her parents had never bothered to sort through. Then there it was, a small wooden chest, half hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but she was drawn to it. The chest wasn't something she had ever seen before, and it seemed oddly out of place among the other forgotten objects in the attic. It was old, maybe even older than the house itself. The wood was dark and worn, and intricate carvings covered its surface, twists and patterns that looked like they belonged to another time. The strange feeling in her chest intensified as she stepped closer. Her hand trembled as she reached for the chest's brass clasp, but just as her fingers brushed against it, The house seemed to groan again, louder this time, as if warning her. Lena hesitated, the feeling of unease settling like a weight on her shoulders. But something inside her urged her to open it. With a slow, deliberate motion, she unlatched the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but darkness, just a deep, impenetrable blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. But as she looked closer, her eyes adjusted, and she saw something. At the very bottom of the chest lay a faded photograph, curled at the edges. Lena reached in and picked it up, holding it up to the light. The photo was old, the edges frayed, but the image was clear. It was a picture of a woman, her face pale, her features striking. Her eyes, however, were the most unsettling part. They stared directly into the camera, but there was something haunting in them, something that made Lena shiver. She turned the photo over. There, written in faded ink, was a name. Evelyn. Evelyn. The name sent a cold shiver down her spine. She didn't know anyone by that name. But as she stared at the photo, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. She felt as though she had uncovered something forbidden, something she wasn't supposed to see. Suddenly, the temperature in the attic dropped. Lena's breath formed small clouds in the air. She could hear the soft, uneven footsteps again, this time coming from behind her. She turned, but no one was there. The flashlight flickered and went out. Panic set in. She scrambled to turn it back on, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it sounded as though someone was right behind her. Lena's fingers fumbled over the flashlight, her breathing shallow. She finally managed to get the light back on, but when she looked around the attic, it was empty. No one was there. But the feeling of being watched, of something or someone looming over her, was stronger than ever. She quickly closed the chest and backed away, her body trembling. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she knew she wasn't alone. Something was here, something that had been waiting. As she hurried out of the attic, the house groaned again, this time with a long, drawn-out sound, like a sigh of relief. Lena slammed the attic door shut behind her and rushed down the stairs, her legs unsteady beneath her. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman in the photograph, her haunting eyes fixed on Lena. And the footsteps, those damn footsteps, echoed through the house, louder and louder as the night dragged on. The next morning, Lena couldn't bring herself to tell her parents. She didn't want to seem crazy, but the events of the previous night were too real to ignore. And when she went to check the attic again, the chest was gone. It wasn't just the chest that had disappeared. The photograph, the strange sense of dread, it all seemed to vanish as if it had never been there. But the feeling that something was wrong, something had changed, lingered. The house felt different now, colder, emptier. Lena didn't know what had happened or what she had uncovered, but one thing was certain. Something had been released, something tied to the house, something with unfinished business. And from that night on, every year as her birthday approached, she could feel it again, the eyes watching her, the footsteps following her, the eerie presence that had been awakened. Story the end.